If you've spent any time learning about the Second World War, you've likely seen photos or videos of vehicles like this Sturmgeschütz next to me. However, we aren't going to be talking about the Stug today, rather these things attached to its sides. Known as Schürzen, which translates to apron, these are also commonly referred to as side skirts or simply spaced armor. Made up of thin plates of either 5mm thick steel or a wire mesh, these have led to a lot of confusion within people who are interested in tank history as to what exactly they were intended to protect against. Some games and other media may lead you to believe that these were for stopping heat projectiles, such as the Allied bazooka. The truth, though, is that these were for solving another problem plaguing German armor on the Eastern Front, that being anti-tank rifles. Vehicles such as the early Panzers and even the Panther featured thin side armor, which made them vulnerable to these anti-tank rifles. While projects such as the Panther II sought to solve this by thickening the side armor itself, it was found that by spacing out thin plates, this would have a similar effect on stopping the bullets. When a bullet struck these plates, not only would it begin to slow down, but it would alter the trajectory of the projectile, causing it to hit at an angle rather than flat on. This was found during firing trials to reduce a penetrating hit to a mere dent in the side armor. For vehicles like the Panzer III and IV, this proved to protect them against AT rifles, but it also made the design of the Panther II obsolete, as these plates on the side of the Panther would do the same thing. This leaves the question though, even if they were originally intended for AT rifles, did they also help against heat projectiles? The answer to that is somewhat complicated.
If you are at all familiar with the concepts used for modern tank armor, it should come as no surprise that spaced armor is indeed used as a defense against various projectiles. Later in the video, we will discuss in more detail how effective it can be for heat rounds specifically, but first, let's consider if this was something the Germans themselves considered. The Germans were absolutely aware of the threat posed to tanks by these sorts of rounds, particularly as the war continued and weapons such as the American bazooka and British Piat made their debut. However, spaced armor, or at least the Schürzen style of spaced armor, does not seem to have been regarded as a potential solution. In fact, one document shows that there were considerations for a composite armor layout utilizing a layer of asbestos to potentially protect tanks. This is far from the first example of composite armor being considered for tanks though, with it technically predating the tank entirely, but that is a topic for another time. Interestingly, although the Germans did not view their spaced armor as protection against heat rounds, the Allies did. As shown in this document provided by Armored Archives, the British noted that it would appear from the thickness of the plate used that the additional armor is primarily intended to give protection against either tungsten core projectiles of the 20mm class or against hollow charge ammunition. Testing of various spaced armor designs on Allied vehicles would also reveal that in some cases it did lead to an increase in protection versus plain armor, but not always. The protection provided largely depends on the type of heat weapon used. For example, testing revealed that the Soviet RPG-6 would be entirely defeated by the Schürzen. However, British testing of their own Piat against similar thickness spaced armor revealed that unless the round impacted at a 30-degree angle or greater, it would still pass through the tank's side armor. As the Germans introduced weapons of their own, such as the Panzerfaust, further testing of the concept was undertaken. These revealed that weaker heat projectiles could be defeated by plates as thin as 1/16 of an inch, spaced 4 inches, 10.2 centimeters, from 30mm of side armor. But more powerful rounds would require upwards of 6 feet, 1.9 meters of spacing. Further post-war testing showed that although spaced armor did lead to a reduction in penetration, it paled in comparison to the use of materials such as glass. As these projectiles continued to improve over the years with innovations such as tandem warheads and increasingly powerful payloads, this has only further reduced the practical effectiveness of spaced armor. While spacing can protect from heat rounds, this is not always the case. In fact, insufficient spacing can actually increase the penetration these projectiles achieve. To understand why this is, we need to first discuss how heat penetrators actually work. Unlike a traditional shell, which pierces the armor through its shape and velocity, heat shells work differently. The diagram here shows us the construction of the shaped charge portion of the projectile. This consists of an HE charge positioned behind a liner cone made of a material such as steel or copper. When detonated, this charge creates a jet of material which is forced at high speed forward like a stream of water out of a nozzle. However, if you were to just place this against a plate of steel and detonate it, you would not achieve the greatest amount of penetration. As shown in this chart, the amount of material a warhead is able to penetrate increases dramatically as you give a greater standoff distance from the target. This is due to the fact that the jet is given space to properly form. Think of this space like a magnifying lens focusing a beam of sunlight. Without it, no matter how hard you try, the light simply will not be strong enough to start a fire. When you add in this magnifying lens, in this case open space for the jet to form, this beam increases in strength. While some early heat shells did not properly implement this standoff due to a lack of understanding behind the mechanics at play, modern heat shells feature sensors far in front of the actual charge to facilitate the jet's formation. This also explains the somewhat odd shape of modern heat rounds with a long pointed nose in front of the body of the projectile. I should also note here that this jet does not melt through the armor as many believe. Rather, the jet forces itself through the armor through its kinetic energy. After a certain distance, the additional penetration provided by the standoff distance will eventually begin to fall off, which is why spacing at larger distances can still provide some benefit. However, as mentioned before, this often reaches impractical levels to achieve any noticeable benefit. This is not to say it isn't still viable, as we see spaced armor being used in combat now in places such as Ukraine. However, the spacing required to defeat these without the use of other things like ERA is often greater than can realistically be installed onto a vehicle. These can also lead to additional problems with the vehicles, such as messing with the turret balance or restricting the traverse angles of the main armament. These modern anti-drone screens actually parallel the idea of Schürzen quite closely, and I plan to cover them more in depth in a future video, as I believe they are a largely misunderstood type of passive protection. Many of these modern spaced armor systems also employ methods to attempt to prevent the heat projectile from fusing to begin with, such as netting catching a drone in flight. This video demonstrates a method using a wire mesh to prevent the fusing of an RPG prior to contacting the hull of the vehicle behind it. One other thing to note about spaced armor is that despite the information I have shown today demonstrating the fairly lacking performance against heat rounds, they did serve as viable protection against high explosive. While it would often result in the complete destruction of the side skirt, the plates could trigger the early detonation away from the main armor, weakening the effect on the main armor plate. Other designs utilized a similar concept with thicker plates to attempt to decap incoming projectiles or even detonate APHE shells before they contacted the main armor. Thicker spaced armor plates can even be used to alter the trajectory of shells prior to them contacting the main armor, although depending on the thickness and angles of the plates, this can have the opposite effect. As I mentioned earlier, the topic of spaced armor is a complicated one.
So that's the story of the German spaced armor used during the Second World War. I want to give a special thanks to the American Heritage Museum for letting me come in here and film with their fantastic collection. If you are ever in the New England area, I highly recommend you come check it out. I'll leave a link below so you can find where the museum is and the hours for when they're open. I'd also like to thank all of you for watching and to my ConelyFans for supporting this content. Hope to see you all in another video coming soon.